Is whimsigoth the ultimate autumn aesthetic? With the air getting chillier and the leaves beginning to turn different shades of brown, it's time to say goodbye to our swimsuits and dust the cobwebs off of our sweaters. My personal favorite season, autumn brings to mind cinnamon-scented candles, apple picking, hot coffee, and rainy days spent indoors. The season also brings with it fall fashion, a transitional style of dressing that can be interpreted in vastly different ways. In today's episode of A Study of Style, the series on this channel where we take a look at a specific fashion aesthetic and do our best to break it down, we'll be examining the whimsigothic aesthetic, what it is, how it came to be, and its identifying features. Let's get into it. With so many people today finding style inspiration online, either on Pinterest, Instagram, or TikTok, the 2020s have seen an assortment of past fashion trends packaged under a new name, with the latest style to be brought back to life being whimsigoth. First seeing a spike in popularity in April 2022, with its celestial imagery, cozy layers, and soothing color palette, whimsigoth has been lauded as the ultimate autumn aesthetic. But do you know what it is? The aesthetic's full name, whimsigothic, was first coined by Evan Collins of the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute back in the summer of 2020. He defined the style as having, quote, existed primarily from the late 1980s to the mid-1990s, contemporaneous with the peak popularity of Gothic-inspired pop rock music, Tim Burton, and the graphic design work of Margot Chase, Fronticus, and a bit of Von Oliver. While the aesthetic is often referred to by its shortened name, the Gothic in whimsigothic is quite important, as it signifies the style's relation to Gothic imagery of the medieval period and the Gothic revival, as opposed to the more recent alternative goth subculture. As the name also suggests, the aesthetic has a touch of whimsy, adding quirkiness and color to a movement that is often considered gloomy and morose. Other niche aesthetics that have popped up recently that exist in the same space include woodland goth, witchcore, and fairy grunge. Although there are slight differences, like woodland goth being more fantastical or fairy grunge having a contemporary alternative edge, there's quite a bit of overlap with whimsigoth, especially when you examine their sources of inspiration. Although the whimsigothic aesthetic is considered to have begun in the late 80s, one of its biggest influences is musician Stevie Nicks. While she's considered a fashion icon today, in the early days of her career, her dark bohemian style led to many people accusing her of witchcraft, something she would eventually poke fun at in her appearances on the television show American Horror Story. These threats eventually got so vicious that Nicks felt pressured to give up her black clothing for a time, and between 1978 and 1982, she phased the color out of her wardrobe. This backlash happened to coincide with Satanic Panic, a conspiracy theory that alleged that satanic cults were committing heinous crimes across the country. None of these allegations have ever been proven, but it did make the public's opinion of witchcraft sour, and many people avoided doing anything that could possibly cause them to be associated with it.
The dripping black sleeves and everything, and the hat, this all went with, this was a style I thought was just absolutely great. And that, continued right into my life. I wear black because I love it, not because it's witchy.
Another inspiration for the aesthetic is singer Kate Bush, who's seen a recent resurgence in popularity after her song Running Up That Hill was featured in the 4th season of Stranger Things. The outfits that Bush wore in her early music videos take inspiration from the medieval period, wearing the low-waisted dresses, hosiery, girdle-esque belts, and velvet, which were popular during that time period. All of these motifs were trending during the 1980s, but it's the specific combination that led to Kate's look coming across as medieval Gothic inspired. Aside from the references to the medieval period, Bush also took inspiration from other macabre eras, as seen with one of her other popular songs, Wuthering Heights, after the Gothic novel of the same name. Examples of Gothic literature first began to pop up during the mid-18th century, coinciding with the Gothic revival in architecture, and these ornamental locations were often used as settings in the novels, hence the name of the genre. Common themes in Gothic novels included isolation, suspense, fear, and torment. And while there were supernatural elements, the true conflict was driven by the mental and emotional anguish of its protagonist. Gothic novels were especially popular with women, likely because many of its most prominent authors like Anne Radcliffe, Mary Shelley, and the Bronte sisters had intimate understanding of women's societal and sexual desires which greatly influenced their work, retroactively being seen as progressive and empowering. Gothic literature saw its heyday during the Victorian era of the 1800s, and to this day that time period is usually the point of reference for Gothic imagery, as opposed to the original movement from the Middle Ages. Well-known examples of Gothic novels from this era include The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, and The Picture of Dorian Gray. In the 1950s, mass-produced romance novels were all the rage, and Gothic literature made a return which lasted into the mid-1970s. Many of the books published during this time period featured artwork that included stereotypes of the Gothic genre, often depicting a woman with a disheveled appearance running away from a castle or a forest in terrible weather. The popularity of these novels could be seen as the catalyst for the mid-century Gothic revival, a movement that was immortalized on television with The Vampira Show, The Addams Family, and Dark Shadows. Horror icon Vincent Price also did the vast majority of his films during this time period, all of which included elements that would become fixtures of Gothic films for decades to come. The popularity of this Victorian Gothic imagery would eventually combine with the punk movement, resulting in the creation of the goth subculture in the 1980s. While an assortment of Gothic films have been released over the years, in the 1990s it was a full-blown craze. Period dramas were rather popular in general during this decade, as seen with Austen Mania, and a variety of Gothic novels were adapted for the screen, including Sleepy Hollow, Mary Riley, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. There was also an adaptation of Interview with the Vampire, based on the 1976 novel of the same name, which brought Gothic elements of the past into the present. With period films being so popular, the Middle Ages also made its way on screen, with action films like Robin Hood, First Knight, Braveheart, and The 13th Warrior being released, as well as campy adaptations of Arthurian legends like the Merlin miniseries. Films that were inspired by the Renaissance, a time period that some argue is an extension of the medieval period, were also popular, and included The Princess Bride, Ever After, and Shakespeare in Love. All of these factors combined would prompt a medieval Gothic revival in fashion, with velvet, embroidery, lace details, religious iconography, and dramatic sleeves making a return. The entertainment industry has always been a reflection of the cultural zeitgeist, and in the 1990s we began to see a rise in practicing Wiccans, which led to Hollywood exploring the art of witchcraft, introducing more people to the practice. With Satanic Panic no longer having the country in a chokehold, witches were able to make a comeback in the media, and the 90s ushered in a wave of New Age witches. Because opinions on the subject of witchcraft had shifted since the early 80s, witches that were depicted in the media were allowed to be more than just the villain, and in some cases were even symbolic of empowerment. This led to the 90s witch being more widely accepted by the public, and their wardrobes were updated to reflect these positive sentiments. I get into this more in my Evolution of Witches video, so I'd recommend checking that out if you want to learn more. Unlike the witches of past decades who wore black capes and pointy hats, some witches of the 90s took on a more fantastical appearance that was vaguely reminiscent of sorcerers. This magical wardrobe included celestial motifs, velvet cloaks, corsets, and rich colors with vaguely historical silhouettes. Characters dressed in this fashion included Claudia from A Simple Wish, the Sanderson sisters in Hocus Pocus, and Agatha Cromwell in Halloween Town. On the other side of the spectrum were hip and trendy witches who donned clothing that were generally in style in the 90s, just with certain motifs that betrayed their witchy ancestry. These contemporary witches included Sabrina Spellman from Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the Hallowell sisters from Charmed, and Willow Rosenberg from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The addition of bohemian style into the wardrobe of the 90s witch can be attributed to the Wicca movement itself. When the new generation began joining Wicca in the 1970s, they brought environmentalist ideas of 1960s counterculture with them, which introduced hippie fashion into the witch wardrobe. By the 1990s, witchcraft and nature had become intertwined, resulting in a style philosophy that had dark and romantic elements of Gothic imagery, combined with the eclecticism and etherealism of bohemian styles. Although witches made frequent appearances in media during the 90s and early 2000s, every witch didn't dress in the style that would eventually become known as whimsigothic. The layered Gothic meets bohemian style was actually reserved for kookier characters, the people who were rejected by the rest of society. As a result, only the characters whose story arc actually revolved around them being outcasts were dressed in the whimsigothic style, like the Owen sisters in Practical Magic or the Coven in The Craft. While the aesthetic was associated with witchy characters, it could also be spotted outside of the supernatural genre, with Phoebe Buffay from Friends dressing in a whimsigothic style that signaled to viewers that she was an eccentric. Outside of television and film, the style was also worn by various celebrities, including Hope Sandoval, Lisa Bonet, Enya, and Helena Bonham Carter. Besides that, the style was also embraced by the high fashion world, making appearances on the runways of Christian Lacroix, John Galliano, and Anna Sui. By the mid-2000s, the style fell by the wayside in favor of a more preppy look, but in the 2010s it made a small return. At the time, it wasn't identified as being part of the whimsigothic trend, instead falling into general soft grunge territory, but it was definitely present, just hidden by studs and skater skirts. You'll note that it was around this time period that we saw a small rise in both witchy and gothic media, with American Horror Story Coven and The Love Witch representing the former, while Dorian Gray, Jane Eyre, and Crimson Peak represented the latter. Similar to how the 90s saw a boom in witchcraft, TikTok is doing a similar thing for the 2020s with witch talk, introducing thousands of people to the magical practice. There's also been an increase in witch-centric media, mostly in the form of remakes or sequels, with The Witches, Hocus Pocus 2, The Craft Legacy, and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina all being released within the last 5 years. The popularity of The Witch has led to many people dressing in a style that takes notes from the previous witch craze, but combined with other trends of the 2020s. Aside from the celebrity influences we've stated previously, Florence Welch and FKA Twigs are more recent inspirations for the aesthetic, with both regularly wearing lace dresses, dramatic outerwear, and deep colors. Outside of the witch community, astrology, tarot, and crystals have become more mainstream, to the point that you can pick up starter packs at your local urban outfitters. This has led to one of the main criticisms of the whimsigothic trend, which is its romanticization of a community that has been persecuted in the past, resulting in contemporary instances of appropriation instead of appreciation. I do agree that people should be careful when it comes to any sort of religious iconography, but at its core, the whimsigothic aesthetic is about embracing what makes you unique. With its gothic influences, a genre known for addressing women's issues and discussing trauma, combined with its witchy history, a movement that has come to be synonymous with women's empowerment, is there no better time than the present for the whimsigoth movement? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!